At this stage, every single ticket compared to an equivalent ticket at the last World Cup is more than twice as expensive. So they're making a lot of money on tickets.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to The Deal. I'm Jason Kelly alongside Alex Rodriguez. So happy to have with us Henry Bushnell. He is the senior writer at The Athletic, covering the beat that everyone is going to be following more than any on the planet, Alex. It's soccer, football, whatever you call it, the World Cup. As of June 11th, is going to block out the sun for the entire world. So Henry is the perfect person to really answer the million questions that we have about this. Henry, welcome to the show.
Appreciate you guys having me. Yes, it is a very complex, grand event, and I'm looking forward to digging into it.
All right. So we're going to start where I feel like every conversation that I have about the World Cup starts these days, and probably you too, which is tickets and ticket prices and ticket availability. Help us understand, and let's just start with, we're Americans here. The U.S. opener, you reported, as of this taping, has 10,000 tickets, give or take, available. This game against Paraguay that's going to happen at SoFi Stadium in Los Angeles. That feels weird. Like, what's happening?
So basically, FIFA overpriced the tickets for this game. And there's a lot of stuff happening. The process has been very opaque. This game will probably be full. But whereas other games, every time tickets go on the market, they sell quickly because there is a ton of demand for this event. FIFA priced this opener as the third most expensive game of the entire World Cup, US against Paraguay, at the start of this process. And essentially, they actually probably underpriced some other games, and there was demand way overwhelmed them. Whereas they probably overpriced this game, and people aren't willing to pay $2,735 or whatever it is for a second deck, ticket behind the goal. And so it's, as you've said, the discussions around this have kind of this is the topic of the World Cup until now, right? And I think this game for a lot of people represents just how aggressive FIFA has been with the pricing of it.
And Henry, is it the ticket prices? You mentioned, 2,800 or so, plus or minus, or is it that you have to fill up such a big stadium in SoFi?
I think it's both. So obviously, yeah, there are some people who have been willing to pay this price. But whereas, all the stadiums are going to be played in, the games in the United States are going to be in stadiums that are 60,000, 70,000, 80,000. So SoFi isn't necessarily unique from that respect. And, one of the stadiums in Mexico is massive as well. The stadiums in Canada and the other ones in Mexico, they're at least 40,000, 50,000. But for a lot of the games, they could sell a 200,000 seat stadium. For any game involving Argentina, involving Mexico, involving England, involving any of these big teams, they could sell 300,000 tickets probably, if they priced it right. And I think it's just, this was one of the few games that they overestimated the demand for it.
No, I think you're spot on, Henry. And the thing is, I just covered recently the World Baseball Classic here in Miami, and Miami's just on fire. Soccer, I'm feeling the energy and the love for soccer, but every game in the World Baseball Classic was absolutely sold out and then some.
Yeah, and so Henry, somebody made a mistake here. Who messed up and why?
Yeah, we don't know exactly who, because as I said, this process has been just super opaque. And we don't know how they set the ticket prices. We don't know who they've consulted, whether in the American sports sphere or, this is a European organization for the most part that has come to America and tried to adopt American sports business practices. And in some ways, I think they understood the market correctly. And in some ways, they probably misjudged it. And I think that tension between a global organization, yes, but really a European-based organization coming into the United States market, that has been central to all of the discussion around ticket prices and just the different expectations that Americans have versus whether it's European soccer fans or South American soccer fans, people elsewhere around the world. So we don't know exactly who made the mistakes. I would also think that FIFA would maybe argue that they didn't necessarily make a mistake, that when you have to set prices, there's some guesswork that goes into it, and you're never going to hit the mark exactly with all 104 games, right? And sometimes you're gonna go too low, and sometimes you're gonna go too high. And as long as they ultimately fill most of the stadiums, which I think they will, if they went too aggressive on some ticket prices, that's probably just a function of trying to maximize revenue on this event, and which in some ways I think they will. Now, if the stadiums aren't full, then it's a different conversation. And we'll see. We really have no clue what it's going to be like because, as we said, FIFA hasn't been transparent with how many tickets they've sold and things like that.
When it comes to FIFA, you mentioned 104 games. How much money approximately does FIFA stand to make if you had to guess?
So they have budgeted about $11 billion from the World Cup as a whole. Yeah, it's a lot. Now that includes sponsorship and broadcast, right? Those are two giant buckets. From ticketing and hospitality alone, around 3 billion. So
Wow.
yeah, it's a lot of money. And part of that, so that's way up from any previous World Cup. And part of that is because of the hospitality capacity at these NFL stadiums, right? They're going to make way more money from hospitality, and they already have made way more money than from hospitality at this World Cup than at any previous World Cup. So it's a big uptick, and yeah, and obviously the other part of that is they're selling tickets for, at this stage, every single ticket compared to an equivalent ticket at the last World Cup is more than twice as expensive. So they're making they're making a lot of money on tickets.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So I had the chance to interview Gianni Infantino, the head of FIFA, a few weeks ago at the Milken Conference in Beverly Hills, and he made a comment. I mean, Henry, you know him well, and Alex, I think you've met him briefly. I mean, he's this larger than life character. He's like made of Teflon. It's unbelievable, and he was talking about the happy barbarians arriving on the shores of America and Mexico and Canada. You've heard him probably use that line, Henry. And I pressed him a little bit and said, well, some of those barbarians a little grumpy at how much they have to pay for tickets. And his response was essentially a variation on what you're saying, Henry. And I'd love to talk about this a little more, which is this notion of these are U.S. market prices. This is what the market demands. And I guess that's another way of sort of talking about what you are, which is they need to make a lot of money. They're a nonprofit, which is kind of amazing to think about. This nonprofit-ish. This all goes to sort of fund the work of FIFA around the world. So they do have to maximize revenue. And man, they are maximizing it. It just is. But to your point, and maybe I'm not even asking a question here, but more sort of opining on this, just the optics of empty seats is brutal and I think it's brutal for something we've talked a lot about on this show, which is what the legacy of this World Cup is, especially here in the United States. Do you agree?
Yeah, and I think it's not just the optics of empty seats, which again, we're not sure that we're going to see empty seats. It's the optics of soccer being an expensive, inaccessible sport.
Great point.
And
great point.
FIFA, yes, you said they're a nonprofit. They exist to develop soccer around the world. And in their mind, that is making a bunch of money from this World Cup and distributing it across the world to different soccer federations. And there's something in that. There's also a lot of like FIFA politics in that. That's how Gianni Infantino stays in power, because he can promise all this money to the federations who then vote for him. But look, another part of developing soccer and growing the game, especially here in the United States, is getting people interested in it. And if the story of this World Cup was all the excitement building around it rather than how expensive the tickets are, that serves a purpose. And so I think the expensiveness of the tickets is going to become an inescapable part of the legacy of this World Cup, and it's doing some harm to it. Now, FIFA would maybe say, and in fact, their Secretary General did say this when I asked him about it a couple months ago. Yeah, but the legacy of the World Cup is also the money that's going to be made and flow to all the soccer federations around the world. And in that sense, the United States is just one of 211 members. And we sometimes look at this too much from a US centric perspective, when a lot of other countries around the world are, in a way, very indirectly going to benefit from this. But I do think it's doing a lot of harm to what this World Cup could do for soccer in the United States.
And Henry, right along those lines, when you think about potentially, I mean, this is such a global experience, and like Jason said, this is going to take over the world here in a few weeks. That's all everyone's going to talk about in the world of sports, as we've been kind of having a drumbeat to it. But in your opinion, which specific city or country around the world wins out the most? And as far as economics, as far as logistics, vibes, goodwill.
It's a really good question. So the US is really going to be the center of this World Cup. Mexico is going to have the opener, and certainly the Mexican and Canadian cities are going to be a significant part of it, but three-quarters of the games are in the United States. Every game from the quarterfinals onwards is in the United States. So the US is really going to be a hub of it. When you look at who got the best games, and that's really going to determine where fans end up going. I think the games in East Rutherford, New Jersey, just outside New York, it's a really good slate. I think Miami got some games that are really going to light up Miami as well. And then you look at a city like Kansas City, for example, that Kansas City is it's the lowest profile of the 11 US cities, for sure. And I think people in Kansas City would admit that. And so they're looking at the World Cup as a way to just like elevate the prestige of the city. And they got Argentina playing there, and Argentina even setting up their base camp there. England and the Netherlands also setting up their base camp there. And there's a chance that, they have one of the quarterfinals as well. And there's a chance that quarterfinal could be Argentina against Portugal. Now there's a lot of steps to go to get there. So some of this is going to depend on how the matchups play out. But there are certainly some cities that got better games than others. And I think the ones that I mentioned are among the cities that got good ones.
You look at the business of soccer very holistically. For sort of building on what you're saying, beyond the performance of what happens during this tournament, who stands to benefit long term, whether that's through their local MLS team or through just sort of a broad interest in soccer or investments in the sports ecosystem, et cetera? And maybe that's part of your answer for Kansas City or others.
It's a really interesting question, because a big part of the story of the organization of this World Cup and all the business around it is that FIFA has tried to monopolize as much of the benefit as it can. And so US Soccer and MLS and a lot of these other entities have been trying to figure out how to kind of draft off of it and get some benefit, but it's been difficult for them because FIFA controls all the revenue streams. On the expense side, the cities have to do a lot for FIFA, and they don't get much benefit in return. So it really is directly, FIFA is getting a lot of the benefit. Indirectly is where you start thinking about all these other entities benefiting from the growth and popularity of soccer in general. So like MLS might not be getting much direct revenue from the World Cup. Yeah. But if soccer grows, and if MLS is able to use smart marketing strategies to kind of convert some of these fans who get hooked on soccer from the World Cup into fans of the local MLS team, then it does have that kind of indirect benefit. I just think it's very difficult at this stage to A, quantify what that's going to be, and B, just conceive how exactly is that going to materialize itself over the next 2 months, and over the next 5 years, frankly. Yeah. How can they convert these people into long-term soccer fans? And we just don't know. It could happen in waves. It could just be a momentary bump that doesn't really have much of a long-term impact. I'm not sure we know yet.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we had Roger Bennett on the show, a few weeks ago, and it's his perspective, as you're well acquainted with, is interesting because we pressed him pretty hard on this idea of the future of soccer in America and, whether the game is really going to catch on. Roger's response is essentially like, no, the boom has already happened. The problem is that most of the soccer fans are tuning into NBC and Peacock on the weekends to watch Premier League. And they're not. I mean, they're definitively not tuning in to the MLS. And so I wonder, as someone who thinks about this, and I want to press you a little bit on something you mentioned, is, you know, can this have a real effect on the MLS, and what does that look like? Like, if you were to paint the best case scenario, is it rising valuations? Is it more fans? Is it better players coming to the United States on the backs of this? Like, what does success for the domestic American league look like coming out of this?
Yeah, it's really tough because MLS is doing great with in-stadium attendances. So they don't necessarily need all these people to start buying tickets. Obviously, that's good. You know, not every
Sure.
MLS game sells out. There is still room for growth there. Where they really need to grow there is with the TV deal. Like, and the TV deal is largely tied to how popular your players are and how good the product is, right? And that's where I think MLS has missed a pretty big opportunity. My colleague Paul Tenorio at The Athletic has covered this a ton, and in fact wrote a whole book that actually just launched today that dives into a lot of this. But MLS failed to loosen its roster rules and salary cap enough to be able to attract better players that would really improve the product on the field in time for this moment where you have a lot of eyes on soccer, and they could have gotten to a point maybe where MLS could have been positioned as pushing into the top 5 leagues in the world and knocking on that door. The person who gets interested in soccer this weekend or this month and next month, what reason do they have to turn on an MLS game versus, as you mentioned, an English Premier League game or a Real Madrid game or a Liga MX game in Mexico? Soccer is very popular here, but the fandom is very fractured and splintered and, you know, divided between a lot of different entities. And so MLS is fighting with all those entities for eyeballs, and they have to give people a reason to tune in. And you can do that with the in-stadium environments, and they've done a really good job of that, and making an MLS game a fun experience on a Saturday night. But there's still the broader TV ecosystem that I don't think they've really cracked yet.
Henry, you know, the other backdrop to this World Cup has obviously been, if you built it, which they have, will they come? Will they be able to get here? You know, you get these sporadic reports. South Africa recently seemed to have some visa issues, even for their team and their technical staff. What are you hearing from your sources around sort of the trends as it relates to people actually being able to get here and feeling like they want to and can be here to witness this World Cup?
I would say that is not as big a problem as a lot of the reports over the past couple of years have made it seem, largely because the bigger barrier is just the expense of attending this World Cup, the cost. And not just the cost of tickets, but the cost of flying to America, of staying at hotels, which, you know, all jacked up their prices to try to capitalize on the World Cup, of the transport, of just everyday things like food in the US. Like, it's more expensive than a lot of countries around. It's expensive to travel to the United States. And so a lot of the people who can afford it have had no trouble getting visas, and in large part are from, you know, relatively rich European countries and they don't feel unwelcome here in any way. Whereas a lot of the people who would feel unwelcome here or who would have trouble getting visas from the countries that don't have the visa waiver program, they probably can't afford to come to the World Cup anyway. Now, there are exceptions because there are people who save up for years and years to come to the World Cup and, you know, take out second mortgages and et cetera, et cetera. Like, there are crazy soccer fans around the world who will do anything to get to the World Cup and who have done that and will be coming. But that's a very small subsection of the fans. So I think the bigger reason that not as many people are going to be coming from abroad as we thought, like the main reason for that is just the cost of this World Cup. But I also would say on that point, I don't think it will like this World Cup is still going to have a ton of international flavor because of something, Alex, you mentioned earlier, I think, because of the diasporas in the United States, right? Like the reason the World Baseball Classic was such a smashing success was because like think about how many Venezuela fans were in that stadium, right? And so
Yep.
you're going to have a lot of, for example, Ecuadorian Americans who, no matter where they are in the US, they're going to go to Ecuador's games, right? You're going to have a lot of Japanese Americans. You're going to, Iranian Americans out in LA. There are all these diasporas that are really going to light up this World Cup in a way that, frankly, no other country can. Like the US is uniquely qualified to
great
host a
point.
World Cup in this way.
I have a quick bonus one, and I know Jason wants to pivot and close, but real quick, I have two daughters, 21 and 18. I've always wanted, part of our bucket list, they just told me last week, they want to go to a soccer game, but in Europe, but experience Yankees versus Red Sox. So if you gave me one recommendation, and all our listeners, what's the one venue, and who are they playing in that venue?
Wow, that's a really good question. I would say, I think I'm actually going to take you outside. If you want a really crazy experience,
Crazy.
go to South America, go to Argentina. Boca Juniors against River Plate would be the single best atmosphere that you could find.
And one in Europe?
And one in Europe, man, there are a lot of good ones in Europe. Bayern Munich against Borussia Dortmund in Germany is pretty darn good. You could go to Celtic against Rangers in Scotland. There are several ones in England that would be good. Barcelona versus Real Madrid. That's probably the best comparison to Red Sox Yankees, actually. Barcelona against Real Madrid in Spain is probably the best comparison. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. So last question for you, Henry. That was a pretty good last question, but I'm going to just like muscle in here. We're so excited to read everything you write and talk about through this World Cup. What's the story you're most excited to write? Like, as you think about the next month, like what's the story you want us to be on the lookout for that you just know that like, regardless of like how it's going to play out, it's just going to be a great storyline?
Man, that's a good question, because I think a lot of what I'm excited about is that I don't think we know what the story is going to be.
Yeah.
But I think in general, we talked about it a bit, but like the world being introduced to American sports culture and just all the contrasts and the cultural clashes that come with that. Like I'm even just thinking about the opener at SoFi Stadium. SoFi Stadium is a crazy venue, right? Like most expensive stadium in the world, all these fancy video boards. Paraguay, who plays against the United States in the opener at that stadium, their national soccer stadium has like 4 very simple video boards, not much advertising. It's just very basic stadium where everything is focused on what's happening on the field. Whereas SoFi is almost the opposite, right? The focus just gets drawn everywhere else. And so it's an entirely different sporting experience. And I think having the World Cup in these venues I don't know exactly what it's going to feel like. I think a lot of people coming don't know what's going to hit them. And I think it's going to be very interesting from that perspective.
It's great to think about, not only how will soccer change the U.S. sporting scene and the future of the sport here, but like how will the U.S. change the game? I mean, we'll see. That's another episode that we'll have to do with you down the line. Get your reaction.
It's the Americanization of the World Cup is kind of how we're thinking about it. Like I think that's going to be the story.
Right. Well, we're looking forward to reading that story and everything else you produce. Henry Bushnell, thank you so much. Senior writer for The Athletic and going to be the busiest guy on the planet over the next month or so. So really grateful to get some of your time ahead of it. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.